Hey guys, what's up and welcome back to the Rocket Hub. My name is Philip and today I'm going to tell you everything that you need to know about Artemis 1. Since there is a lot to cover, the video is broken up into chapters with the timestamps on screen right now. Feel free to jump around between the sections and rewatch them if needed. With that said, let's start. For quite a few years now, NASA has been playing around with the idea of returning humans to the moon for the first time since the Apollo program. Fittingly, the new lunar spaceflight program is called Artemis, after the Greek goddess of nature and hunt, who is Apollo's sister in mythology. The ultimate goal of the Artemis program is erecting a sustainable outpost on the moon's south pole, while doing so is significantly cheaper than the Apollo program. Started in 2017, the Artemis program aims to land 2 humans, among them the first ever woman, on the moon by 2025, although a later date is more likely considering that this has been delayed already. The Artemis program is a governmentally funded program, meaning all money spent by NASA or their contractors is acquired from the Congress and effectively taxation earnings. In total, the Artemis program alone has cost $23 billion already, with a few additional billions having been invested in other programs like the Constellation Crewed Launch Program, of which many parts and designs have been copied into Artemis. The different projects inside Artemis include the Orion Command Module, NASA's latest spacecraft, the Space Launch System, spacesuits, ground equipment, and supporting missions like the Capstone satellite that launched last month. Alongside these things, NASA is also developing the Lunar Orbital Platform Gateway, short LOPG or just Gateway. Hiding behind this rather obscure name is a space station placed in a special orbit around the moon, which future Artemis astronauts will prepare in for their landing on lunar surface. Speaking of the landing, NASA has selected commercial contractors to supply lunar landers for the Artemis program, both crewed landers and small robotic landers and rovers that assist astronauts on the moon. Among these contractors are SpaceX, Firefly Aerospace, Astrobotics, and many more. So, that is the short version of what Artemis is all about. We are going to dive into the future of the program later in the video, but first we'll talk a bit more about Artemis 1, the mission coming up in potentially just a few days. But before we take a look at the mission profile and objectives, we check out the rocket. Artemis 1 is, just as every other Artemis mission, set to launch on the Space Launch System, or SLS. The specific vehicle used in this case is the Block 1 Crew variant of the SLS, the least advanced of the planned versions. The SLS in its current form is a 2.5-stage vehicle that stands at 98.1 meters or 212 feet tall and can carry up to 95 tons of payload to low Earth orbit. It features an enormous core stage of 65 meters in height and 8.4 meters in diameter. This massive core stage is propelled by 4 RS-25 engines running on liquid hydrogen and oxygen, generating a maximum of 9.1 meganewton or 2 million pounds of thrust. The core stage is, as most of SLS, based on shuttle technology, but is, despite similar looks, quite different from the shuttle's external main tank. The stage with its 4 RS-25s is way too weak to lift SLS off the ground. 2 5-segment, 54-meter-tall P-band ACPC solid rocket boosters assisted for the first minutes of flight. These boosters are upgraded and larger versions of the Space Shuttle's SRBs and generate a total of 29.2 meganewton or 6.6 million pounds of thrust on sea level. After separating both boosters and the core stage, propulsion of SLS is taken over by the interim cryogenic propulsion stage. As the name suggests, this is only temporary, but more to that later on. The ICPS is a hydrogen-powered upper stage derived from the upper stage of the Delta IV, measuring only 5 meters in diameter and 13.5 meters in height. Powered by a single RL-10 engine, the second stage only provides 110 kN or 24,800 pounds of thrust, but makes up for that with its 465.5 second specific impulse. On top of the second stage sits the payload, in case of the SLS Block 1, the Orion spacecraft. Orion is a crew capsule that was initially developed by NASA for the Constellation program, but was later transferred over to the SLS after Constellation got cancelled. The Orion Command Module has a diameter of 5 meters or 16 feet and is 3.3 meters or 10 feet tall, but sits on top of the European Service Module provided by ESA, making the entire stack 7.3 meters or 23 feet tall and extends the maximum diameter to 4 meters or 13 feet. With a total habitable volume of 9 cubic meters, Orion can support up to 6 astronauts, but will likely only ever fly 4. Maneuverability is provided by one main engine and more RCS thrusters, and power is supplied by the service module's 4 solar arrays. To ensure crew safety, also features an ablative heat shield, radiation-absorbing materials, advanced avionics and controls, and a large launch escape system on liftoff. This configuration, known as the SLS Block 1, will be used on Artemis 1. However, there are some upgrades slated for SLS after this mission. The first of which will be the Block 1B upgrade, featuring an advanced upper stage known as the Exploration Upper Stage, featuring 4 RL-10 engines instead of the single one on Block 1, and will also be available as a cargo variant. Even later in the evolution of SLS, the Block 2 variant will receive advanced boosters and a larger 10-meter diameter payload fairing. Now that we know the launch vehicle that is going to be used in Artemis 1, it may be helpful to look at the mission profile and what maneuvers are going to be performed by SLS and Orion during Artemis 1. The goals of Artemis 1 are, at least compared to future missions, relatively simple. The mission is basically a test run for both SLS and Orion and is therefore uncrewed. I totally forgot to mention that until right now. I'm sorry. Anyway, since every Artemis mission from Artemis 2 onwards will always carry 4 astronauts, the very first mission is mostly there for testing the system and collect helpful data about different parameters. As a secondary mission, SLS will also send a total of 13 CubeSats to the Moon, which release during different parts of the mission. Apart from that, SLS doesn't carry any other payload apart from the Orion spacecraft, consisting of crew and service module. A little fun fact right here, Orion will obviously not carry humans on this mission, but still has some passengers. NASA has decided to put 2 female mannequins in the crew module, riding all the way to the Moon and back. The task of these 2 fellas is measuring the effects of cosmic radiation on Orion's interior. These mission goals can only be achieved during Orion's complex predetermined flight path that will take the spacecraft on a journey taking about a month, during which it will travel more than 1 million miles. The Artemis 1 mission is set to take off from Launch Complex 39B at Kennedy Space Center, Florida. Due to orbital mechanics and the position of the Moon relative to the Earth, liftoff has to occur in tight launch windows, one of them reaching from late August to early September, and a second one later in October. However, NASA has determined 3 possible launch dates for Artemis 1 on August 29th starting at 13:33 UTC, September 2nd starting at 17:48 UTC, and September 5th at 22:22 UTC. Specific times may vary since the launch windows are open for 120 minutes each. At about 8 seconds before liftoff, SLS will start the 4 RS-25 main engines on this core stage and slowly throttle them up to maximum thrust. 8 seconds later, on T-0 seconds, the massive SRBs ignite and the SLS lifts off the pad. After passing through max Q and powering SLS out of the atmosphere, the boosters burn out and separate at T+120 seconds. The core stage then takes over propulsion of SLS on its own and carries the second stage and Orion almost all the way to orbit. At 3 minutes and 40 seconds after launch, the launch abort tower riding atop Orion is going to jettison, along with the fairing encasing the service module. Then, at 8 minutes and 14 seconds and already 157 kilometers above the ground, the core stage finally burns out, leaving the upper stage and Orion on a suborbital trajectory in order for the core stage to be safely disposed. After deorbiting the core stage and deploying Orion's solar arrays, the ICPS upper stage will perform a perigee raise maneuver to enter a stable orbit around our home planet. After orbiting our home planet at least once, the upper stage will perform the translunar injection burn and raise Orion's orbit to intercept the Moon a few days later. The exact timing of the burn depends on how many orbits Orion goes through before doing the TLI. This can be basically any number above 1. After pushing Orion on its trajectory towards the Moon, the ICPS will eventually detach from the spacecraft, leaving Orion on its own. After coasting through space for about 4 days, Orion will eventually arrive at the Moon. About 4 days after TLI, Orion will use its own little maneuvering engines to perform a gravity assist flyby just 100 kilometers or 62 miles above the lunar surface to enter what is called a distant retrograde orbit, or DRO. This particular orbit takes Orion on a path moving opposite to the Moon's rotation and takes about 6 days to complete one orbit. During the stay in DRO, Orion will reach its farthest point from Earth at about 437,000 kilometers or 271,000 miles. Orion is going to stay in this distant retrograde orbit for anywhere between 6 and 19 days before starting its way back to Earth. Once ready for the return journey to Earth, Orion will once again light its own engines, leave the DRO orbit, and perform another lunar flyby to shoot itself on a trajectory back to Earth. The exact duration of the return journey will be slightly longer than a trip to the Moon, since Orion provides far less delta V than the SLS upper stage and the lunar escape velocity is much lower. Therefore, the return trip could take more than 1 week, depending on the exact timing of the earlier steps. Closing in on our home planet, Orion's crew module will separate from the European service module, which is jettisoned and burns up in the higher atmosphere. Shortly after, the crew module reorientates, heat shield first, and begins the atmospheric re-entry. While going through the violent re-entry procedure, Orion will slow down dramatically and use up its ablative heat shield. At about 7.2 kilometers above the Pacific Ocean, the parachute deployment procedure begins, deploying a series of drogue chutes and later 3 main chutes. Orion will splash down in the Pacific Ocean off the shore of Southern California and will be picked up by a US Navy recovery ship. In total, the Artemis 1 mission will take somewhere between 26 and 42 days from launch to landing. Since Artemis 1 is part of the Artemis program, it won't be the last mission of SLS and Orion. Currently, there are at least 7 more Artemis missions scheduled, but their objectives and timelines constantly change. So far, only Artemis 2 and 3 are being worked on and have a set schedule and objective. Expecting no further delays, which is quite unlikely, Artemis 2 could happen as early as May 2024. The mission will see Orion take astronauts to the Moon on a free return trajectory, perform a crewed lunar flyby, and further test Orion's life support systems and maneuverability. This mission is set to take less than 21 days and will utilize the same SLS and Orion configuration as Artemis 1, just a different trajectory and with humans on board. The really interesting part of the Artemis program begins with the Artemis 3 mission. Scheduled for no earlier than 2025, this mission will carry Orion into a near rectilinear halo orbit, a highly elliptic path above both lunar poles, where it will meet up with a modified SpaceX Starship. The Starship will then undock from Orion, which remains in the halo orbit, with 1 or 2 astronauts still on board, and descend towards the lunar surface to perform a crewed lunar landing at the Shackleton crater near the Moon's south pole. This will mark the first crewed lunar landing since Apollo 17 back in 1972. The astronauts are set to stay on the lunar surface for 6 days and 12 hours. The next big upgrade to Artemis is scheduled for Artemis 4. This flight will, for the first time ever, launch on the upgraded SLS Block 1B variant, which features the upgraded exploration upper stage. Furthermore, Artemis 4 will carry the International Habitation Module, or IHAB, to the Gateway station in lunar orbit, which should be in place by then. Gateway will reside in the same near rectilinear halo orbit and function as a hub for lunar and deep space operations. There are at least 4 more Artemis missions up to Artemis 8 planned as of 2022, with options for additional missions far into the 2030s. By then, NASA will have extended the Gateway with further modules and implemented the SLS Block 2 upgrade with the next generation BOL boosters. At some point, Artemis is also set to establish a fixed base on the lunar surface that can host astronauts for months and eventually even permanently. Artemis 1 marks the beginning of a new chapter in space exploration. For the first time since 1972, humans will eventually return to the Moon in the next few years. As early as August 29th of this very year, NASA may take the first big step towards that goal and get Artemis rolling. Through a complex mission profile, taking SLS and Orion on a 26 to 42-day trip around the Moon and back, engineers at NASA gather the final testing data needed to place a crew inside the next-generation spacecraft and send them to the Moon. With backup dates potentially available in late October and early November, Artemis 1 should almost definitely happen this year. But remember, this is the first launch of a new rocket, and despite having been in development for more than a decade by now, SLS may still be full of tiny flaws that could cause many aborts and extensive delays. Personally, I don't really expect Artemis 1 to launch on August 29th during the very first attempt, but rather a successful liftoff during attempts 2 or 3 in early September. Regarding the chances of a successful mission outcome, we have to consider that this is a NASA-developed vehicle. The risk of SLS failing in flight is, compared to other rockets' maiden flights, quite low, and Orion should also perform almost flawlessly, considering that it has already flown before on a Delta IV Heavy. After all, there isn't a second try scheduled yet, and a failure could push the launch of Artemis 2 back by quite some time. If you plan on watching a launch live, there should be a lot of possibilities to get a video feed here on YouTube and also on other platforms. Let's just hope SLS finally launches this year. It'll be a spectacle you shouldn't miss out on. And that's already everything that you need to know about Artemis 1, NASA's next moon mission. Let me know in the comments whether you are as excited for this mission as I am, and if you enjoyed the video, which I really hope you did, why don't you hit the like button and subscribe to the Rocket tab. I really appreciate all of your support. We see ourselves in the next video, and until then, I'm out. Cheers!